All right, my guest on today's CCA Leadership Development Community interview series is Chelsea Adler, PNC Actuary at Root Inc. and creator of Inspiring Actuaries. Chelsea, in this next section, this next segment, I want to talk for a few minutes about your views on the actuarial profession and insurance specifically. And partly this comes from some stuff that's on your Inspiring Actuaries website. You said one of the goals that you set out with Inspiring Actuaries is to, and I'll quote it directly here, change the narrative around insurance. So
Mm,
talk to us a few minutes about that, if you would.
yeah. So I think maybe for some of us that are immersed into the insurance world, we can probably more easily see that it is a product that was created to ultimately be a good thing. But the sad reality is the majority of the world tends to view insurance as a necessary evil at its best. And so I think it might be helpful to provide a little bit of background on kind of my experience or perception around insurance. I mentioned earlier that my dad is a State Farm agent. And when I was growing up, my dad always made it a point to get to know his customers on an individual personal basis. Like it was so much more than insurance to him. And in fact, whenever things would go wrong in the lives of his clients, he would often be one of the first people on the scene to help them. I remember my dad taking my sister and I over to an elderly woman's home after a storm, and the three of us pulled branches off of her house. And when someone's loved one passed away, like my dad would be there to comfort them and always be at everyone's funerals and celebrations of life. And so just the way that I saw insurance be modeled by my father and how it could be a really personal experience. And one of State Farm's slogans, I think it used to be, like a good neighbor. Like my dad just lived that out really, really well. And so that was inspiring to me. And I just think that I'd love to see the industry get back to that. And so, yeah, when I say I want to change the narrative around insurance, I want people's reaction when they think of insurance to not be one of dread and cringe, but one of like, I'm so glad that that product exists. Like how much better is society because insurance is a thing? And so I think there's a lot we can do to accomplish that, but that's kind of the backstory for, why I have that desire.
Sounds like you've got a future in marketing ahead of you.
I mean, never say never, right?
All right, you mentioned this with Root, that they're considered part of the insurtech market, and that's obviously a buzzword in the actuarial field. I know the Society of Actuaries, they, I think, put on an annual insurtech conference as well. But I think for a lot of people, they hear the word, but they don't necessarily know what that means or understand what it is. Would you mind just explaining to our listeners what is insurtech?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, there's probably not like one agreed upon definition, but my impression is it's really just the coming together of two industries, be it the tech industry and insurance. And in my experience in this realm, there's really just a mentality shift from, what can we do given certain technological constraints to what can we do if anything was possible and how can we use technology to enable that. And so yeah, I think that certainly most people would agree that technology has completely changed all of our lives, especially in the last 10, 15, 20 years, and it will continue to do so. And I think there's this recognition that insurance is somewhat of an archaic industry, and it's kind of hampered by some old legacy systems. And so if we can kind of jump into new technology and then use that to make insurance, the product better and the experience better, there's just a lot of potential there.
How will that factor in for actuaries, right? Like you talk about the
Mm.
increase in technology. I mean, there's a lot of things, again, talked about, whether it's in the data science, data analytics, predictive analytics fields, about AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. How are those things going to influence the role of an actuary when you start thinking about the insurtech market?
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, top of mind for a lot of people, especially just, you know, there's some legitimate concern of like, oh my goodness, is our job going to be replaced by robots? And I firmly believe that is just not, that is not an imminent risk, because while you know, computing power and machine learning has evolved so dramatically, and there's a lot of benefits to that, I still on a regular basis see the value and absolute need for human intervention with these models. I just met with someone the other day who works for a company that is very focused on AI and model governance, and just making sure that there isn't ingrained bias in our models, and that even if you have built from a statistical standpoint the perfect model, it could still have an output that is not logically correct, and that's just kind of a scary thing, and I think that at least for the near future, like, we really are going to continue to need actuaries and people who understand the nitty-gritty details, but then can also understand the business or the bigger picture to be able to interpret these models and make sure they are implemented correctly and we don't have unintended consequences.
Which I think we're in the same vein there, and probably a lot of people, right? That's what makes being an actuary fun,
Yeah,
is
for
being able
sure.
to get into some of that stuff. Well, let's talk about your views on the future of the profession, and what skills actuaries need to develop to be successful. You know, in these changing environment, like you said, we've got more data available. There's more technology to process that data. Um, how for someone that's saying, all right, I want to be an actuary, or maybe they're starting in that path, they're taking exams, and they get to that point where they're like, all right, well, what's next? Um, what skills do they need to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly many. I think that's one very clear thing about the profession is that in general, actuarial professionals are well-rounded. I mean, we have so many different skills that make us successful. In my opinion, probably two of the most neglected skills within, you know, our community is communication and leadership. I think that the analytical focus maybe like there's definitely, there should be focus on the analytical side, but I think we can sometimes forget or neglect the reality that you can do the best analysis in the world, but if you can't communicate the result of that analysis to the stakeholders in an effective way, then you just really limit your ability to have impact as an actuary. And so I think that encouraging folks to be more well-rounded and not just focus purely on the numbers, but to think about things bigger picture and the implications of the work that they're doing on a more holistic basis, and then honing in on the skills of communication and leadership. I think that's what's really going to take the actuarial profession to the next level. A lot of times, I think actuaries are certainly, you know, we've got this reputation as being experts in the numbers, but it's funny when I talk to folks that are like surprised that I or someone else who's a good communicator is an actuary. It's like, that shouldn't be surprising. That should be characteristic of our profession because it is so critical to the work that we do. So those are the two that I think could make the most difference long term.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100% on that. And well, what would you say? You're clearly a natural communicator. I think that's probably just innate in your personality. So for other people, though, what kind of recommendations do you give them as far as trying to hone in on those skills?
Well, I'm flattered that you would say that, but I personally don't think that is actually true. I have had a lot of practice over many, many years to feel comfortable as a communicator, but I certainly didn't start there. For me, when I was in college, I was a part of a Christian ministry on campus, and I was always kind of the person that would like sit in the back, and, you know, I was there, but I wasn't really like putting myself out there. And after a year or two of being involved, I was asked to be one of the two student athletes who got up front and like led the discussion every week. And this wasn't scripted. It was like ad hoc, very kind of on the fly. And I was like, absolutely not. I cannot do something like that. That is terrifying to me. But by God's grace, with some encouraging, I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And over the next 3 years, I put myself out there and did something very uncomfortable. And over time, you know, with most things in life, the more you do it, the easier it gets. And so I realized how valuable it is to make an intentional effort to practice skills that I'm not as comfortable in, because again, if they're important, it's important to prioritize. And so for me, that was a hugely impactful experience for me. And there's so many other opportunities like that for students. I know there's Toastmasters and other just like clubs people can get involved in, where if you take on any amount of leadership role, like you will have opportunities to communicate and to speak and to partner with others that will just slowly over time help you get better at those skills. I also remember in my early days as an actuarial analyst, I recognized that the people who were viewed as leaders among the group were often the folks who were most vocal in team meetings. And, you know, early on, you're going to feel like, well, I don't know much. Like, what could I possibly say to contribute to the conversation? But the reality is, you can always ask questions. And so I challenged myself. Like I made it a goal for myself to speak up at least once every time we would get together as like a big group, and make my presence known just by like asking a question or making it clear that I was paying attention and engaged in the conversation. So I think there are very simple and practical things people can be doing, and it's not an overnight fix. I mean, I've been an actuary for almost 9 years now. And again, I had that experience in college for 3 years. So it's been an ongoing, constant practice, and I'm sure I will continue to get better as I work on it. And so I think it's important for people to remember that for most things, like these skills, the key to success is consistency and time, you know? So just finding little ways that you can practice consistently and doing it over and over and over.
Oh, I really liked what you said, especially about the asking questions part. In fact, I was reflecting on an experience I had yesterday where I was meeting with one of my teams, preparing for a client meeting that we have this afternoon. And one of the members of our team, he's a relatively new actuarial analyst. And my boss, who's the CEO of our company, he was in this meeting as well. And he went to this actuarial analyst. He said, look, your job tomorrow is to come up with questions to ask after the fact, like things that you didn't understand. I want us to circle back around, and I want you to be able to ask those questions. And I know in especially in my company and in my line of work, with those actuarial analysts, the ones that ask questions, I think are viewed as, oh, these people have a lot of potential because they're speaking up. It's showing that they're curious, they're inquisitive, and they're not afraid to say, hey, I don't know everything, you know, somebody help me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something else that, you know, this has changed post-COVID with our remote world. I think how to put yourself out there looks a little different now, because again, most of us aren't sitting in the same office space together anymore. So maybe just speaking up in a meeting isn't going to be enough. You know, it could also just be something as simple as, if it's a somewhat larger group and a couple people have their cameras off, like turn your camera on, like make it known that you are paying attention to the conversation. You're not working on something on the side. Like it does look a little different now that we're in this remote environment, but you have to make a conscious effort to realize, you know, especially your boss, like they don't get to see 100% of what you do. So maximize the time that you have with other leaders, with other coworkers, make the most of that, because it really does make a difference.
That's probably good advice for anybody, regardless of where they're at in their career, right? You know, I can see the applications even for someone at a senior level, right? Being on camera, being engaged in those remote meetings to show people, set the tone as well. I
Yeah.
mean, that all comes into it. No, I think that's great. So really honing in those communication skills, those leadership skills, however you can. I think that's really good advice.